Good day, class. A historic day to all of us. This is Mr. J. de los Santos, the faculty in charge of GEC 105. Today, I will deliver a lecture on Philippines in the face of colonialism from Spanish, American to Japanese periods. Now in this lecture, it is expected from you that you will be able to explain the motives of Spanish, American and Japanese colonialism. Present the historical events of the Philippines from Spanish to Japanese periods. Identify the different colonial rules and policies, and the Filipino responses. And to understand the factors that contributed to the development of Filipino nationalism. Before the lecture begins, ready yourself, your mind and attention. Your pen and paper for note-taking. Okay? Are you ready? If yes, then let's get started. During the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe saw an age of exploration, and expansion brought about by various factors. First, there was the economic motive of finding a direct access to the profitable Oriental, referring to Asia, trade of luxury goods, such as silk and spices. Spices like pepper, ginger, nutmeg, onions and garlic were the most important items of trade from the East. Owing to the desire of the Europeans to enhance the taste of food and to preserve meat during winter time. Now in the map, you can see Constantinople, or today known as Turkey. This area played a very significant role in the trading routes towards Oriental. However, after the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, commercial routes to the east fell under the control of Muslim traders who, along with the Italian city-state of Venice, monopolized the supply of highly prized Oriental products to Europe. Attempts were made by European monarchs and merchants to break the monopoly by sending voyages of exploration to discover alternative routes to Asia. Second, scientific and technological progress, specifically in shipbuilding, cartography, and navigational instruments, significantly contributed to the success of the exploratory expeditions. This trend was exemplified by the efforts of the Portuguese Prince Henry, who established a navigational school that gathered together scholars and sailors from all over the Mediterranean. Look at this map. This shows Portuguese exploration in the 15th to 16th centuries, the leading country during the Age of Expedition. Third, the quest to explore unknown and distant lands also involved the religious mission of spreading the Christian faith. Spain and Portugal maintained an anti-Muslim attitude emanating from the recent reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula against the Muslim Moors and a religious zeal to convert the peoples of Asia and Africa. It's trivia time. Did you know that the term Moro was first coined by the Spaniards? When the Spaniards arrived in the Philippine archipelago in 1565 and discovered that some of the inhabitants were Muslims, they called them Moros, in the same manner that they called those Muslims from North Africa who had conquered and occupied Spain for nearly 8 centuries from 711 to 1492. Now let's continue. With the advent of the Age of Exploration, Portugal and Spain initially led the navigational race to the east. In the map projected, you can see the different areas explored by the Europeans. Portuguese sailors explored the coast of the African continent, and in 1498, Vasco da Gama successfully reached India by rounding the Cape of Good Hope and sailing to the Indian Ocean. The port of Malacca, an important Southeast Asian entrepot, was captured by the Portuguese in 1511. Meanwhile, the Italian sailor Christopher Columbus was able to convince the Spanish crown that he can reach the east through a western route. In this attempt, he unsuspectingly reached the enormous American continent but thought it was India. These expeditions inevitably led to the acquisition of colonial territories and the founding of new settlements. In 1519, the Portuguese sailor by the name of Ferdinand Magellan would try to fulfill Columbus's promise of reaching the east by sailing west in search for Spice Island. Now look at the map. This shows the route taken by the Magellan expedition 1519 to 1522 in what is considered the first circumnavigation of the world. The 3-year journey started in the southern port of San Lacari, Spain in 1519 with 5 ships commanded by Ferdinand Magellan. They crossed the Atlantic Ocean and followed the coast of South America in order to locate a passageway through the continent, a narrow strait which was eventually named after Magellan. The expedition then crossed the unexpectedly vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. They later on encountered Ladrones Islands and from there to Samar Island in central Philippines on March 16, 1521. This event marked the coming of the first Spaniards in the Philippines. The next day Magellan ordered his men to land at Hominhan Islet so the sick men could be taken care of. Having rested, Magellan proceeded to Limasawa, which at that time was ruled by Raja Colombo. He befriended the Raja and his brother and sealed their friendship with a blood compact. This was the first blood compact between Filipinos and Spanish. On Eastern Sunday, March 31, Magellan ordered a mass to be celebrated on the islet. Magellan ordered that a large cross be planted on the top of a hill overlooking the sea. Guided by Raja Kulambu, they entered to the harbour of Cebu on April 7, 1521. Raja Humabon made a blood compact with Magellan. On April 14, a mass on the shore of Cebu was held. Magellan planted a huge wooden cross and gave Queen Juana, wife of Humabon, an image of the child Jesus as a gift. However, Raja Humabon and Datu Zula of Mactan welcomed the Spaniards but not Lapu-Lapu, another chieftain in Mactan. Lapu-Lapu refused to accept the new political system and to pay tribute. He decided to break away from Raja Humabon. To teach him lesson, Magellan invaded Mactan on April 27, 1521. Thus the Battle of Mactan. Magellan was killed in the battle. The battle was scandalous defeat of the Spaniards, for they were not able to prove themselves better in combats. Later on, the remaining members of the expedition were forced to flee the islands before the Cebuanos could kill them all. With this, the expedition was continued under the leadership of Sebastian del Cano. He skillfully guided the party through the Moluccas or Spice Islands, the Indian Ocean, the Cape of Good Hope at the tip of Africa, the Atlantic Ocean and finally back to Spain in 1522. You can also check this on YouTube, just search Ferdinand Magellan, First Circumnavigation of the Earth by Simple History for you to see clearly how it all happened. But one thing is for sure, the voyage enhanced their knowledge about the existence of other islands in the Pacific. It is also confirmed that the Earth is round and that it is really possible to sail around the world. Now, after the Magellan-Elcano expedition, what happened to Philippines? Through Magellan expedition, it paved way for Spain's expansion to the Orient. Driven by the thrill of adventure and the reward of gold and spiritual dispensation, the conquistadores took the risks of the journey. First post-Magellan expedition in 1525 was led by Captain Garcia Jofre de Loaisa but failed to reach Philippines. Sebastian Cabot headed the second expedition in 1526 but failed to find the Strait of Magellan. In 1527, Alvaro Saavedra constituted the first expedition to the Philippines from Mexico. They reached Surigao but failed to colonize. In 1542, King Charles I sent another expedition through Ruy López Villalobos. Later he named Leyte as Filipinas in honor of the future King Philip. During the reign of King Philip, Spain was at the height of its power. He wrote to prepare an expedition for the conquest of the Philippines. The command was given to Miguel López de Legazpi. His fleet, consisting of 4 ships with 380 men, left Mexico on November 19, 1564. On February 13, 1565, Legazpi anchored near the island of Cebu and went to Samar, and to Bohol. On April 27, 1565, Legazpi arrived in Cebu and later on established the earliest Spanish settlement. In 1569, Legazpi transferred to Panay and established their second Spanish settlement. In 1571, Miguel López de Legazpi and his force decided to sail to Manila. By this time, he held the title Adelantado, advanced officer. As Spaniards approached, the natives in Manila set their houses on fire and fled. On May 18, 1571, after negotiations with Raja Matanda and Lacandula, the Adelantado conquered Manila. 3 years later, on June 21, 1574, Manila was given the title La Insigne y Siempre Leal Ciudad, or the Distinguished and Ever Loyal City. With this, the Philippines was a crown colony considering that she was under Spanish domination. From the beginning of Spanish rule in 1565 to 1821, Philippines was a dependency of Mexico. The Mexican viceroy, in the name of the King of Spain, administered the country. One of the first tasks of the Spanish colonizers was to unify the Philippines under one faith and under one colonial government, with Manila as its center. In order to facilitate the easy conversion and pacification of the natives, certain colonial institutions were set up in the Philippines. Before the arrival of the Europeans, the natives were settled in scattered communities with no central government. One of the solutions of the colonial government was to resettle the natives. In 1582, the Synod of Manila was established under the Dominican Father Domingo de Salazar, the first bishop of Manila. A plan was presented by the Franciscan Father Juan de Plasencia to the Synod of Manila, and this was called the Reducción, and was approved unanimously by all the religious orders. With the plan, the Spaniards attempted to tame the reluctant Filipinos through Christian indoctrination in a quite novel settlement pattern using the plaza complex. To the Spaniards, the Reducción was a civilizing device to make the Filipinos law-abiding citizens of the Spanish crown. It is also worth mentioning that, as soon as Legazpi started colonizing the Philippines in 1565, the encomienda system was established. Originally, it was a combined purposes of rewarding deserving Spaniards and attracting others to settle in the colonies. Permanent settlement of the Spanish soldiers assured the defense of the colonies. This also facilitated the conversion of the natives to the Christian faith. However, encomienda in the Philippines was not a land grant. It was more of an administrative unit for the purpose of exacting tribute from the natives. The encomienda was later abolished little by little due to corruption and abuses. It was replaced by the alcaldía, an institution with more political functions than economic. In order to support the colonial government and the missionaries at work, different colonial institutions that were economic in nature were also instituted in the Philippines. Tributes were imposed to the natives through royal decrees. The payment of annual tribute was seen as a form of vassalage to the King of Spain. However, by 19th century the payment of tribute was replaced by the cédula personal. Another colonial institution was polo y servicios, or forced labor, which referred to drafting laborers who were either Filipino or Chinese male mestizos aged 16 to 60 years. They were obligated to give a 40-day personal service to community projects such as the construction and repair of infrastructures such as the church, building of galleons, or cutting logs in the forests. It was only in 1884 that labor was reduced to 15 days. I hope you are still watching. However, the imposition of the Catholic faith, excessive collection of tax, forced labor or polo, and the usurpation of land by the religious orders triggered off reactions from the Filipinos, which came in the form of revolts. These revolts happened during the early part of Spanish colonization, particularly in the 16th and 18th centuries. Moreover, these revolts took place in different parts of the Philippines. Attempts of preserving the old religion by Filipinos inspired the revolts led by Tamblat of Bohol and Bangkao of Leyte. Both revolts took place in 1621. The demands of forced labor or polo took a toll on the Filipinos and were seen in the revolts led by Sumoroy of Samar in 1649 and Maniajo of Pampanga in 1660. As religious orders usurped lands from the natives, agrarian uprisings became rampant in the provinces of Batangas, Bulacan, Cavite, Laguna, and Rizal in I-745–1746. However, opposition to colonial authority became quite difficult. Although the Spaniards constituted a small number in the country, they had conscripted natives from different regions to put down revolts in other regions to remain in power. The opening of the Philippine ports to world trade in the early 19th century had set into motion significant political and socio-economic changes. There was economic development because of the export demand of certain crops like sugar, tobacco, and abaca, and the entry of foreign capital which stimulated local agriculture. This, in turn, gave rise to the land estates or hacienda dedicated to the cultivation of cash crops such as sugar, rice, or tenants to mange their lands. The new system launched a wealthy class of Filipino haciendero families were mostly Chinese mestizos and natives. Also, the Educational Reform Decree of 1863 opened institutions of higher learning in the colony to all who afford it. This reform gave the rich mestizos and natives the opportunity to send their children to the schools and the colleges in Manila and, if possible, to Europe. Their distinguished education and considerable wealth differentiated these ilustrados from the masses of Indios. They would lead the criticism against the colonial government, which was then known for its corruption and incompetence. They would exert efforts to propose political and economic reforms beneficial to the colony. The Catholic Church and the friar orders in particular, which have long exercised great influence over colonial affairs, would be another target of the liberal-minded Filipinos. Within the Church, however, there was also a movement for change led by Father Pedro Peláez and later Father José Burgos, demanding for equality of treatment between Filipino secular priests and Spanish regular clergy, and the turnover of the administration of local parishes to the hands of the Filipino priests. This became known as the secularization issue. Unfortunately, the movements for liberal reform and secularization would be destroyed by state repression, which followed the Cavite Mutiny on January 20, 1872. Prominent Filipinos including lawyers, businessmen, and priests were implicated as conspirators of the revolt in Cavite. Many were imprisoned and exiled while some were executed, the fate that befell Gomez, Burgos and Zamora priests. On February 17, 1872, the three priests marched from Fort Santiago to Bagumbayan, now the Luneta Park, and were executed through garrote. These events would awaken the consciousness of the younger generation who witnessed the tragic fate of their teachers, families, and friends, and would later bring the struggle for change to Spain. So what developments took place after the Gomburza execution? The propaganda movement was essentially a Filipino-led campaign for reform and assimilation. This can be dated from the appearance of the reformist bilingual newspaper Diaryong Tagalog in 1882 to the demise of the publication La Solidaridad in 1895. Filipino students and professionals then living in Spain engaged in public speeches, political lobbying and petitions, and publication of books, pamphlets, and articles. In order to expose the conditions in the Philippines and advocate necessary reforms. Among the main organizers and contributors to the movement were renowned Filipino ilustrados, such as José Rizal, Marcelo del Pilar, Mariano Ponce, Graciano López Jaena, José María Panganiban, and Antonio Luna. Composed of young, wealthy, and brilliant mestizos and natives who went to study or live in Spain. This generation of intellectuals was responsible for the creation of a Filipino consciousness which they articulated in their writings and which influenced many minds in the Philippines. Their nationalist ideas and ideals would ultimately inspire and make possible the Revolution of 1896. In the end, the campaign proved to be a failure as basic rights and privileges such as freedom of speech, the press, and association and representation to the Cortes, the highest lawmaking body in Spain, continued to be denied to the Filipinos, despite the tireless striving of Filipino propagandists and their Spanish sympathizers. Several important circumstances contributed to this failure. One is the political instability in Spain caused by the struggle for dominance between the liberals and conservatives, which resulted in abrupt changes within the ruling government. Mired in its own internal predicaments, the Spanish government paid little attention to the concerns of its overseas colonies and depended upon the influence of the religious orders. In relation to this, one of the primary objectives of the Filipino propagandists was to destroy the power and prestige of the friar class. The friars themselves were engaged in counter-propaganda, funding newspapers which answered the accusations of the Filipinos. It's trivia time again. Did you know that the Spoliarium, often misspelled Spolarium, is a painting by Filipino painter and reformist, Juan Luna, the brother of General Antonio Luna? The painting was submitted by Juan Luna to the Exposición Nacional de Bellas Artes in 1884 in Madrid, where it garnered the first gold medal. Juan Luna gained great popularity among the Filipinos because of this painting. He was in fact recognized by José Rizal for his achievements in one of the gatherings in Spain. Now let's continue. Another factor of the failure was the personal rivalries among the ranks of the Filipino ilustrados, the most unfortunate of which was the break between Rizal and Del Pilar. In 1892, Rizal proceeded to return to the Philippines disillusioned with the reform campaign in Spain. He then founded the La Liga Filipina on July 3, 1892 with a group of patriotic Filipinos including Bonifacio. The aims of La Liga Filipina were the following: to unite the whole archipelago into one strong body, to give mutual protection of all members in case of necessity, to encourage agriculture, commerce and education, to defend members against any kind of violence and injustice, and to study and apply reforms. On July 6, 1892, José Rizal was arrested by the Spanish authorities and was subsequently sent into exile in Dapitan. La Liga Filipina, the organization that Rizal established in the Philippines, had to persist with its founder incarcerated. What was left with La Liga was eventually Cuerpo de Compromisarios, which continued the aspirations of the former. On the other hand, another group that exhibited a militant form of nationalism was established the day after Rizal's arrest. At the night of July 7, 1892, Andrés Bonifacio with Deodato Arellano, Valentin Diaz, Teodoro Plata, Ladislao Diwa, José Dizon, among others, formed the Katashtasan Kagalangalangang Katipunan ng Mga Anak ng Bayan, or the Katipunan. The secret society aimed to separate from Spain, defend the poor and the oppressed, promote good morality, and reject religious fanaticism and obscurantism. The resort to radical means can be seen as a reaction from the failure of the propaganda movement to have tangible reforms that could alleviate or even eradicate the colonial condition. Hence, revolution was the logical option for a dissatisfied people to liberate themselves. The story of the 1896 Philippine Revolution is usually examined in two phases. The first phase began with the discovery of the Katipunan on August 19, 1896, after Teodoro Patino, a Katipunero, confessed the secrets of the society to Father Mariano Gil, an Augustinian friar in Tondo, Manila. The Katipunan was discovered when Patino and Apolonio de la Cruz had a misunderstanding. After the Spanish authorities proved the existence of the society, they conducted mass arrests and cordoned Manila. Luckily, Bonifacio and his men managed to escape and proceeded to Balintawak. On August 23, 1896, more than 1,000 Katipuneros met at the yard of Juan A. Ramos, the son of Melchora Aquino. It was on that day when the iconic cry of revolution transpired. The revolutionaries tore their cédulas as a sign of taking up arms against the Spaniards. By August 30, the revolution had spread to different areas around Manila. This prompted Governor-General Ramon Blanco to declare a state of war unto the provinces of Manila, Cavite, Laguna, Batangas, Bulacan, Pampanga, Tarlac and Nueva Ecija. Rizal, after being exiled to Dapitan and short trip to Spain, was returned to Philippines, and on December 30, 1896 he was executed at Bagumbayan. It's trivia time again. Did you know that José Rizal wanted to be simply buried with a stone or a cross to mark the grave? The hero did not ask for a tall memorial to honor his death. In his letter he said, "Dear parents, brothers, sisters, give thanks to God who has kept me tranquil before my death. Bury me in the earth, put a stone on top, and a cross. My name, the date of my birth, and that of my death. Nothing more. If later you should wish to surround my grave with a fence, you can do it. No anniversary celebrations. I prefer Pong Bundik." But nothing from these were followed. On the other hand, the revolution would change its course when Bonifacio was invited to Cavite in order to intervene in the growing rift between the factions of Magdalo and Magdiwang. For this purpose, three important assemblies transpired in the said province which, only ultimately, decided the fate of Bonifacio as the leader of the revolution. The Assembly on December 31, 1896, the Tilleros Convention on March 22, 1897, and the Second Tilleros meeting the following day. The March 22 elections in Tilleros, which was marred by claims of electoral fraud, catapulted the Magdalo General Emilio Aguinaldo to the presidency of the new revolutionary government. This compelled Bonifacio and his followers from the Magdiwang side to meet in March 23 and draft their protest through the Acta de Tierros. The following month, another document called the NAIC Military Agreement was created to officially form an independent government headed by Bonifacio. Although these were attempts for the Supremo to reassert his leadership in the revolution, Aguinaldo and his camp saw them as acts of treason against the elected government. Andres, together with his brother Procopio, would be violently arrested at Limban in Indang, Cavite. Thereafter, both were subjected to a court-martial which lasted from April 29 to May 4. On May 8, 1897, the judge of the military court, General Baldomero Aguinaldo, recommended the verdict of death sentence for the Bonifacio brothers. President Aguinaldo commuted the punishment to exile but was persuaded by the likes of General Mariano Noriel and General Pio del Pilar, among others, to revert to the original verdict. The fateful day of May 10, 1897 marked the execution of the Bonifacio brothers at the foot of Mount Tala in Maragondon, Cavite. Due to continuous military campaigns on Cavite directed by Governor-Generals Camilo de Palavea and his successor Fernando Primo de Rivera, they moved its headquarters from Talisay, Batangas to Biak-na-Bato in San Miguel, Bulacan. And they formed the Biak-na-Bato Republic. Aguinaldo authorized the ratification of the Biak-na-Bato Constitution, on November 1, 1897. But later on, Aguinaldo acceded to the Truce of Biak-na-Bato in December with the Spanish government. With this, the first phase of the revolution concluded in December 27 when Aguinaldo and his men left for Hong Kong from Pangasinan to honor the conditions of the truce. The return of Aguinaldo to the Philippines in May 1898 marks the beginning of the second phase of the revolution. This was during the time when the United States had officially declared war on Spain on April 25, 1898. Convinced of the necessity to immediately organize a provisional government upon his return, Aguinaldo proceeded to Cavite to establish a dictatorial government. This was followed by efforts on the Filipino side to assert their freedom. The Declaration of Independence was celebrated on June 12, 1898. The local governments were reorganized in June 18, and the dictatorial government was replaced by a revolutionary government in June 23. I am back. It's trivia time again. Did you know that Philippine Independence Day used to be celebrated on July 4? The United States granted the Philippines its independence on July 4. This date is now considered the Filipino-American Friendship Day. In the early 1960s, the Philippine Historical Association lobbied for June 12 to be the official Independence Day once again. In 1962, President Diosdado Macapagal issued a proclamation recognizing such change. It was in 1964 when the country began celebrating Independence Day on June 12 again. Now let's continue. On the other hand, the Spaniards through Governors General Basilio Agustin and his successor Fermín Jardines, were secretly communicating with Admiral George Dewey and General Wesley Merritt for the conditions of surrender. The Americans agreed to stage a mock battle at Manila Bay on August 13, 1898 to make it seem that the Spaniards fought for the Philippine colony until the bitter end. By this time, Aguinaldo and his forces already had strong suspicions towards their American allies. Nonetheless, the Filipinos persisted in their quest for self-determination. The Malolos Congress convened at the Barazian Church in Bulacan on September 15, 1898. This paved the way for the creation of a constitution that inaugurated the First Philippine Republic on January 23, 1899. Simultaneously, tensions between the Filipinos and the Americans were amplified when the Treaty of Paris was signed on December 10, 1898 and the Benevolent Assimilation Proclamation was issued by United States President William McKinley 11 days later. The rupture of hostilities between both camps came unexpectedly when the San Juan Bridge incident transpired on the night of February 4, 1899. The ensuing Philippine-American War 1899–1902 lasted 3 years and resulted in the death of over 4,200 American and over 20,000 Filipino combatants. As many as 200,000 Filipino civilians died from violence, famine, and disease. There were two phases to the Philippine-American War. The first phase, from February to November of 1899, was dominated by Aguinaldo's ill-fated attempts to fight a conventional war against the better trained and equipped American troops. The second phase was marked by the Filipinos' shift to guerrilla-style warfare. It began in November of 1899, lasted through the capture of Aguinaldo in 1901 and into the spring of 1902, by which time most organized Filipino resistance had dissipated. President Theodore Roosevelt proclaimed a general amnesty and declared the conflict over on July 4, 1902, although minor uprisings and insurrections against American rule periodically occurred in the years that followed. In 1902, the American colonial government designated the 4th of July as the official end of the insurrection of their newly acquired possession, the Philippines. Back in 1899, U.S. President William McKinley sent to the Philippines a mission tasked specifically to assess the Philippine situation and to establish a civil government in the islands. This delegation, called the First Philippine Commission or Sherman Commission, was headed by Jacob Sherman, then president of Ivy League school Cornell University, together with George Dewey, Elwell Otis, Charles Denby, and Dean Worcester. The commission gave some key recommendations to the U.S. President on how to proceed with the establishment of colonial rule in the Philippines. First, it suggested that a civil government should supplant the existing military administration, established in August 1898 after the American victory in the mock Battle of Manila and first headed by General Wesley Merritt. Secondly, it recommended the creation of a bicameral legislature, with the lower house to be composed of Filipino statesmen while leaving the upper house to American colonial administrators. And lastly, the Sherman Commission likewise endorsed the improvement of the general sanitary conditions of the Philippines and the founding of a public school system to educate the Filipinos. A second delegation led by William Howard Taft was sent to the Philippines in the June 1900. The Second Philippine Commission, also known as the Taft Commission, proceeded to execute the recommendation. In October of the same year, this Philippine Commission was given the authority to exercise legislative powers in the Philippines by President William McKinley. Ultimately, on July 4, 1901, a civil government was established, known as the Insular Government, with Taft himself as the Governor-General. The government established by the Americans, by and large, was a government controlled by the Americans with the Filipinos in charge of running or operating it, Filipinos who were wealthy and educated, pro-Americans and westernized in their lifestyles. The Americans took several steps to train the Filipinos for self-government before the grant of independence. First, they passed the Cooper Law or the Philippine Bill of 1902. This law was responsible for the establishment of the Philippine Assembly, which gave Filipinos the right to be represented in the lawmaking body through their elected delegates to the Assembly. Second, the Americans passed the Jones Law in 1916, which handed over both houses of the lawmaking body exclusively to the Filipinos. It also promised to grant independence to the Filipinos as soon as a stable government could be burdened therein. Third, the Americans under Governor-General Francis Harrison gave the Filipinos greater participation in the government. This was done by employing trained Filipinos in low and high positions in the government. This process was called Filipinization. Fourth, the American Congress passed the Tydings-McDuffie Act in 1934, which provided for the establishment of a transition government called the Commonwealth. At the end of this transition period, the Philippines would finally be given her independence. On May 14, 1935, the Filipino people approved the Constitution. On June 16, 1935, an election was held. Quezon and Osmeña ran in the same ticket and won as president and vice president, respectively. On November 15, 1935, the Commonwealth government was inaugurated in front of the Legislative Building in Manila. Hi. I hope you are still watching. The so-called peacetime of the decade of the 20s and 30s in the Philippines was shattered when Pearl Harbor, which was home to the U.S. naval installation in the Pacific, was bombed by the Japanese on December 7, 1941, December 8 in the Philippines. Soon after, military installations in the Philippines such as Clark Air Field, Nichols Air Field, and Sangley Point were bombed by the Japanese. The bombing of these military installations aimed to weaken American bases in the Pacific. The Philippines as an American colony was inevitably dragged into the war. The defense of the Philippines was a priority of the Commonwealth government in the light of an expansionist move of the Japanese. The first legislative measure of the Commonwealth government was the National Defense Act. This act provided the establishment of an infantry consisting of a reserve force and an active force, an Army Air Corps, and a Navy. In 1941, the military forces of the U.S. and the military forces of the Philippines were put under a single command and was headed by Douglas MacArthur. This military force was known as United States Armed Forces in the Far East, USAFFE. Japan, then an emerging power together with Italy and Germany, formed the Axis powers. With the outbreak of World War II, the US and Great Britain agreed to pursue a Europe First policy, which meant the war resources of the two countries would concentrate in defeating Nazi Germany while simultaneously fighting the Japanese in the Pacific Front but with less resources. Once Nazi Germany is no longer a threat to Great Britain, the Allied powers agreed to concentrate their forces against Japan. This being the case, Japan aimed to free Asia from its Western colonizers by giving independence to the colonized Asian countries. It was on this occasion that Japan enunciated its Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which aimed at freeing Asian countries from their colonial masters but with the recognition of Japanese authority in the region. The Philippines as an American colony was thus to be freed from the clutches of the U.S., hence the occupation of the country from the Japanese invaders. Hostilities between the Japanese against Filipinos and their American allies then ensued in various points of the archipelago. President Manuel Quezon, together with the other high-ranking officials of his U.S.-sponsored government, were forced to move out of the Philippines and to establish a government in exile, first in Australia and then in Washington. Filipino-American troops, which numbered around 80,000, held out in Bataan against the assault of the enemy forces. Thousands of soldiers and civilians perished due to malnutrition, dysentery and malaria. The infamous Death March began in Mariveles and Cabcaban on April 10, 1942. The Filipino-American troops were forced at gunpoint to march from Bataan to San Fernando, Pampanga. Meanwhile, after the fall of Bataan and Corregidor to the forces of General Masaharu Homma, General Douglas MacArthur had left the Philippines for Australia in March 1942 via Mindanao. It was also in Austria that MacArthur, the military advisor to the Commonwealth government, was quoted saying, "I came through and I shall return." MacArthur's pledge, which sparked some hope among Filipinos amidst Japanese violence for the next 3 years, was finally fulfilled on October 20, 1944, when his forces landed in Leyte, liberating the Philippines from the Japanese. The following weeks and months witnessed American and Filipino victories all over the archipelago. Provinces in the Visayas, then in Luzon, were secured one by one. After a destructive and bloody campaign against the Japanese, Manila was liberated on March 3, 1945, then the entire Philippines on July 5, 1945. Wait. It's trivia time again. Did you know that Philippines saved 1,200 Jews during the Holocaust? From 1937 to 1941, about 1,200 European Jews found refuge from the Holocaust in the Philippines. Their migration was part of an effort by the Philippine President Manuel Quezon and Paul MacNutt, wherein they devised a strategy to grant visa to Jews. Now let's continue. Outside the Philippines, Japanese forces were also on the retreat. Japan announced its surrender, through Emperor Hirohito himself, in a radio broadcast in August of the same year before being formally recognized by other belligerent parties on September 2, 1945. This surrender took place in the U.S. warship Missouri while docked at Tokyo Bay. The war in the Pacific was finally over. Thanks for listening. Should you have questions or clarification, I am willing to answer it next meeting. In this lecture, the following sources, books were used.